A couple weeks ago, a paper came out that I genuinely haven't been able to stop thinking about. A researcher took the April 2025 LSAT, the real one, and he fed it into a bunch of different AI models. One of them got a perfect 180. Now, if you're studying for the LSAT, that probably sounds either terrifying or pointless. Like, what's the point of grinding endless logical reasoning for 6 months if a computer can outscore you in less time than it takes you to read the prompt? But I want to make a case to you today that this is actually one of the most useful pieces of advice that anyone studying for the LSAT could find out this year. Because once you understand what the study really found, it changes how you should be studying. Now, here's what happened. The researcher ran the AI models through the LSAT twice. The only thing that changed was that the second time, he turned off the thinking step. He forced the models to answer the questions without reasoning. When that happened, reading comp scores barely moved, but logical reasoning scores fell off a cliff. Now, that collapse, the gap between an AI that's thinking and one that isn't, is kind of similar to how I studied when I went from a 152 to a 175. And I've seen the same students cross that gap thousands of times over the past 20 years. And this AI study is actually giving me a pretty clean way to explain things. There is also one specific move every high scoring AI made that you can steal starting today. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. But first, I want to tell you the story of how I figured out all of this because the personal version is honestly the only way to really understand it. When I took my first LSAT practice test, I scored a 152, bottom half of test takers, pretty low for someone who'd been told his entire life that he could be a really strong test taker. Now, the part that really got under my skin was the review, because I would sit down with my wrong answers, and the right answer would be obvious to me, like painfully obvious. Now, the wrong answers I picked were clearly wrong, and I could explain why every right answer was right, why every one was wrong, so why did I miss them when it counted under timed conditions? It took me a year to figure that out. And the answer is exactly what this AI study just proved. Because I wasn't really reasoning through the questions, I was just reacting. I would read the argument fast, get some kind of gut feeling about what it was saying, then I would scan the choices, looking for the one that matched my prediction. That was the whole strategy, I just didn't know it at the time. Which is mechanically the same exact thing the AI was doing when they turned off its reasoning step. Now, this is where most LSAT advice on the internet's going to lose you, because the standard advice for someone in my situation back then would have been to take more practice tests, read faster, drill more questions, buy more books, but none of that's what fixed it straight up. And if you're stuck at 162 right now, and someone's telling you to read faster, I want you to ignore them, because speed is not the issue. It's the process you're running on every question that's the issue. When I changed up my LSAT prep, the thing I changed wasn't volume, it was the actual sequence of mental steps I ran on each question. I started off by finding the conclusion first, before I even looked at the answer choices. Then I would figure out what the argument was actually claiming, where the gap in the reasoning was, and what I thought the right answer ought to look like. Only after that would I read the 5 choices. And at that point, I was just crossing off 4 wrong choices, and on my retake, that's when I scored a 175. I was the same person, using the same study material, had the same brain, just a different process running through it. And that's what this talk is about today. The study, the gap it exposed, and the 2 specific drills I used to close it for my students. For those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and what I'm about to walk you through today has worked on every kind of student I've coached. Now, real quick on that AI study itself, the researcher took the April 2025 LSAT and fed it to 8 different reasoning AIs, including GPT-5, Claude Opus 4, Kimi K2 Thinking, and a few others, plus 2 smaller distilled versions as a control. Kimi K2 answered every single question correctly, got a perfect score. GPT-5 missed one, which still technically maps to a 180. Claude Opus 4 got 98.7%, also a 180. And 5 out of the 6 frontier models scored above 97%, which puts them in the top 1% of human test takers. The 2 smaller distilled models scored below 64%. Now, one group is achieving something almost no human achieves. The other group is doing barely better than guessing. And the researcher wanted to figure out why. And that's where the second experiment comes in. Now, a quick aside, if you haven't used a reasoning AI before, these models don't just spit out an answer. Before they respond, They work through the problem internally, they consider different interpretations, check their work, they reason it through, and then they commit. Now, you can watch this happen if you use Claude or ChatGPT in their reasoning models. There's a visible thinking step that they're using at play. The researcher turned that off, forced the models to answer immediately, which is basically how most students take this test. Now, here's what happened. Claude Opus 4 lost 3.9 points on logical reasoning. In reading comp, it only lost 0.2 points, barely anything. GPT-5 lost 3.8 on logical reasoning. On reading comp, it only lost 2.7. So I want you to sit with that. What it's actually saying is that almost everything the AIs are getting right in logical reasoning, they're getting right because of that reasoning step. If you take that step away, the score plummets. But on reading comp, it barely matters. Whatever the AI is doing on reading comp is more pattern matching. It's recognizing structure, finding the answer that fits the shape of the passage, not really reasoning per se. Now, that difference between the logical reasoning and reading comp, it has big implications for how you study for the LSAT. Now, here's what almost everybody gets wrong about logical reasoning when they start prepping. They treat it like a reading test. Their mental model is, I'm going to read the argument, I'll understand what it says, and I'll pick the answer that best matches my understanding. Which sounds reasonable. It's basically how you'd approach almost any other exam. But that's not what logical reasoning is testing. Logical reasoning is a reasoning test. It's in the name. The reading is just the warm-up. The actual question, the part that determines whether you get it right, is what you do after you've read the argument. So if I were to give you a logical reasoning question and say you have 60 seconds, you would just read it and pick whatever feels right. And you would get about 60% of those right. The easy ones you would nail, probably 100% accuracy. Medium ones, 50-50. Hardest ones you'd be guessing. But if I gave you the same question and said you've got 10 minutes, find the conclusion, map the premises, figure out where the gap is, pre-phrase what the answer should sound like, and then check the choices, you'd probably get almost all of them right. You'd have this totally different result with the same brain because the question is testing whether you can find the structure of an argument and spot what's missing. It's not an English test. So that gap in the study with reasoning on versus reasoning off, that's the whole game right there. And it tracks exactly with what I see in coaching. The most consistent pattern I see in students stuck at 162 or 165 is that they're reading too fast and they're answering too fast. They're not reasoning. They're just reacting to the surface of each question. So when I have a student in that range review a section, meaning they go back and redo every question with no pressure, they almost always score in the high 170s, sometimes a perfect 180. So the questions and the content are not the problem because they already have the skill. What is broken is the process they're running under time pressure. When they're under stress, they skip the step that matters. Now, there is a real question, a real LSAT logical reasoning question on the April 2025 LSAT that the smaller AI models consistently got wrong. The larger models with reasoning on got it right, so we can use that gap to pull out something useful here. The argument goes roughly like this. In 1685, the colony of New France was running out of currency, so to deal with it, the local governor said they could use playing cards as money. And the cards started being used as legal tender. Therefore, the argument concludes, New France was the first place in the Americas to use paper currency. And the question asks, what's wrong with that argument? If you read it fast, it kind of makes sense. You've got cards being used as money. The dates work out. But if you read it slowly, you realize that the evidence was about playing cards. The conclusion is about paper currency. A playing card is technically made of paper, I guess, but paper currency is a specific term. It refers to official government-issued paper money. Playing cards being used as IOUs in the colonial times is a clever workaround, but it's not really paper currency in any meaningful sense, and so there is a hole in the argument. Evidence is about one thing, the conclusion is about a different thing. And the argument is pretending those two things are the same when they're not. So this is a flaw in a sense. It's a term swap. Argument uses one term in the evidence, different one in the conclusion, and switches between them hoping nobody notices. Most people don't notice that either, and AIs without reasoning steps don't notice, and that's the whole point of the trap. Now, the smaller AI models saw cards being used as money, they saw the conclusion about paper money, and they decided the relationship was close enough. Which misses the real flaw, because the flaw is not about the availability of currency, it's that cards are not paper currency in the first place. But the bigger models with reasoning on, they caught it because they did the obvious thing. They paused, asked what the conclusion was really claiming, and then they matched the noun and the conclusion against the noun and the evidence, and the gap jumped down. It's the same exact mistake humans make when they read fast. So what I want you to do is called pre-phrasing. You make a prediction. For every logical reasoning question that asks about flaws, assumptions, strength, and weaken, which is the majority of the exam, you find the conclusion. And I know that sounds obvious, but nobody actually does this under time pressure. You've got to ID the actual claim being made in the argument before you look at any answer choice. If you skip ahead to the choices first, you're probably going to get it wrong because you're going to be biased by what you see there. You want to focus on the key noun in the conclusion, the specific thing the argument is making a claim about. In our example, it's paper currency. Then you go back to the evidence and you look for that exact noun, the exact word or phrase that explicitly refers to the same thing. And if it's not there or a different noun is being used, that gap could be the flaw. The right answer is almost always something that names the gap or bridges it. Now, the reason this works is because the structure of these arguments is always the same. Evidence, conclusion, assumption, bridging them together. The right answer relates to the bridge. Once you know that, it becomes a simple checklist process. So if the evidence is about, say, people who exercise regularly, and the conclusion is about people who are physically healthy, the right answer will connect those two ideas. The wrong answers play with one noun and ignore the other. Or they talk about a related but different concept. Or they're true in real life, but irrelevant to this specific argument. So when you've already found the noun and gone hunting for it in the evidence, the wrong answer traps stop working on you. You'll go into the choices knowing what the bridge has to look like, and you can work by elimination. And the reason most students mess this up is because they forget to run that process under timed conditions, under pressure. They'll do it perfectly on the first 3 questions, then they forget, they fall behind, or they get stuck, or they get tired. You've got to run this process on every single question, not just the hard ones, because you want it to be automatic. Now, another issue that AI had with the LSAT was the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. You've got to have this concept totally locked because it shows up in necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, strength and weak and flaw, parallel, principle, basically everywhere. So to define them, necessary means required. If something is necessary for X, you can't have X without it. But just having it doesn't mean that you will have X because other things might also be required. Now, in contrast to necessary, you've got sufficient. Sufficient means enough. If something is sufficient for X, having that thing alone guarantees X, nothing else is needed. So for example, oxygen is necessary for fire. You can't have fire without it. But oxygen on its own doesn't cause fire. You've also got to have fuel, you also got to have a spark. And so while oxygen is required for fire, it's not enough. And this is the most common trap on the LSAT by a huge margin. So for example, in an LSAT argument, they'll tell you that X is necessary for Y. Then the argument concludes that since you got X, you'll have Y. That is the swap. So for example, to get into Harvard Law, you need a high LSAT score. Jordan has a high LSAT score, therefore Jordan's getting into Harvard. If you read it fast, it kind of makes sense, but it's wrong because while a high LSAT score is required for Harvard, it's not enough. Harvard also wants a great GPA, rec letters, personal statement, work experience. The score gets you considered, but won't automatically get you admitted. So let's say, for example, to score 170 or higher on the LSAT, you've got to master logical reasoning. Jordan has mastered logical reasoning, therefore Jordan's scoring 170 plus. Still feels great, but it's also still wrong because logical reasoning is required, but you also got to have reading comp mastered as well. That's still a third of your score, right? So Jordan could ace logical reasoning, bomb reading comp, and still score below 170. Now, the reason this trap is so brutal on test day is because the LSAT writes these questions specifically to feel airtight if you read them fast. The language sounds clean, and they can slip those things past you without you noticing. And that single issue causes students to lose 5-10 points on the LSAT every time it shows up. So anytime you see words like must, needs, required, essential, you got to pause. Those are necessary condition words. They're telling you something is required. They're not telling you that something is enough. So when you spot those trigger words, restate the argument as A is needed for B, A is here, therefore B. If the argument fits that shape, you've got the flaw built in there already. Then look for the answer that names the mistake, something like the argument confuses a necessary condition with a sufficient condition, or the argument fails to consider that meeting the requirement does not guarantee the outcome. Now, the way I would drill this is take 20 logical reasoning questions untimed, and for every question that uses any necessary condition language, force yourself to rewrite the argument in the A is needed for B format. Force it in if you can. If you do 100 reps of these, it's going to become automatic. When you see the word must, your brain will check whether the conclusion is treating it as sufficient, and that will help you break into the 170s. Now, you also want to look for different types of wrong answer traps, wrong answer patterns, including out of scope, things that are half right, half wrong, swapping the terms. Those three things account for the majority of wrong answers people fall for. I've got a bunch of others mapped out in my free LSAT cheat sheet, linked below this video. Too much to get into right here. The link to grab that is unpluggedprep.com/cheat sheet. The link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. I'm also offering a free LSAT tutoring lesson for everybody watching this now and later. The link to book that free tutoring with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. Link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG.